Atomic Heart doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up. On the one hand, it wants to do this. Enormous, beautifully executed visions of an alternative future, Soviet sci-fi utopia. And on the other hand, you just have to let your glove explain the plot to you for 15 hours, and you don't really get to interpret that world for yourself. Sorry. This game was phenomenal in some areas and really lacking in others. And throughout all of it, it desperately wanted to be the love child of Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and BioShock. It never quite got there, but it made a really valiant effort to. And despite that, while I was intrigued, it also made me want to just put it down and give up on it a dozen times during my playthrough. It's a really mixed bag. So, let's review Atomic Heart. The game is developed and partially self-published by Mundfish. It's their first game outside of a VR title about 5 years ago, but they dropped that to focus on this. The studios state on their website that their full team is made up of about 130 creatives from 10 different countries, including Poland, Ukraine, Austria, Georgia, Israel, Armenia, UAE, Serbia, and Cyprus. I'm not going to talk about the political controversy surrounding the game in this video. I've talked about that elsewhere. For now, this particular piece of content is just going to focus on the game itself. So, let's talk story. I'm not going to give you any heavy spoilers here, so you don't need to worry about that. I'm just going to give you the basics which you learn in maybe the first half hour of the game for now. It all takes place in Facility 3826. You play as Sergei Nechayev, who is overall just a really grumpy soldier who's also referred to as P3. Your boss is a scientist called Sechenov, who you sometimes refer to as a wizard, other times just as the boss, and you clearly have a lot of respect for the guy. He also invented and helped work on a lot of the breakthroughs that Facility 3826 are benefiting from, such as primarily this polymer. They've used polymer to really advance a lot of their areas of research, and it's those areas that have pushed the Soviet Union forward. Like, the game takes place in 1955, and they've got all sorts of things like, for example, a technology that allows you to listen to music from the future. Like, they start talking about Billie Eilish at one point, which I thought was really funny. And they've also got this artificial intelligence network that they call Collective. Now, Sechenov's developed a device that will allow people to control that artificial intelligence network remotely, and they call that a thought device. And much of the game revolves around Sechenov's goal of getting humanity en masse to implant thought devices and other people's skepticism of Sechenov's true motives. One of those other people is not a person at all, but is actually your glove, called Charles, or Charles. And as you progress through the world, the glove consistently pops up, gives you some color about it, explains things around you, and is just sort of a trusty companion as you go. You are very sarcastic and negative about the world. You're really just disgruntled by everything, it seems, whereas the glove is a little bit more perky. And I think that's a really good thing because it is truly an incredible world. The opening sequence for this game just has to be seen to be believed. It's something so different to anything I feel like I've experienced in a game before, not because of any particular technical design, not because of a certain feature that they've implemented really well. It's just a really beautifully realized vision of this Soviet utopia, and it felt damn good. You get about 20 minutes or so of exploring this insane opening sequence where you almost feel like you're in Destiny because of the scale of everything, the grandiosity of it all. But instead of being on the moon, you're just in Moscow or something. Except you're obviously not in Moscow because you're on a flying cloud platform thing. It's really awesome, and the game has a lot of that DNA throughout it, where you're looking at the environment in front of you going, man, this is cool. But sadly, I think they really do it best in those opening 20 minutes. Once the world descends into chaos, and you can imagine what happens when people start trying to control robots, the world just gets a little bit less interesting. You end up underground, you're locked down there, it's lots of corridors, there's a huge number of locks on the doors, to the point that your character actually starts commenting on it repeatedly, saying, Jesus, couldn't they have thought of a better way to keep me down here than just locking all the doors? And that's unfortunate because you feel like you're missing out on that really inspiring world around you because you're in, like, the janitor's closet. However, you adjust to that and you move through the world and you get out of some of those initial corridors, and it does start getting a lot more interesting again. And through the game, there are certain moments where you're like, oh, okay, this environmental design is kind of going crazy right now. Layers of Fear, the game, feels like it was almost an inspiration in certain areas here, in the sense that they're almost trying to create these esoteric images in front of you, and this feeling of almost curation in the environment around you, telling a very specific story, seeking a very specific message, but doing that with not just the usual things like graffiti on the walls or whatever, but also like the way that the bodies are strewn across the corridors. And I don't think it was groundbreaking in this regard, but I really enjoyed this throughout. What I didn't enjoy throughout, sadly, was the actual gameplay itself. Throughout the game, you unlock about a dozen different weapons. Half of them are melee-based and half of them are ranged. And while a lot of them really look cool at first, very quickly you realize that they're all pretty underwhelming. The ranged weapons often feel a bit janky or often just feel weak. The aiming system in the game is really not the best, to the point where I was trying to bump my sensitivity down and it got way too slow, and then I would go one notch higher and it would start spinning around much faster than I wanted. Like, just aspects of precision in that area in terms of the actual experience of playing the game were really unpolished, and I think that that could improve in time, but certainly at launch, playing a review copy of the game, it meant that it didn't ever really feel good to control my character. And that goes for the melee as well. The melee weapons end up feeling pretty similar to one another, and while it's really satisfying to swing at some kind of fleshy enemy and decapitate them or something like that, it ends up actually kind of being annoying because you end up in situations where you're just taking damage and you don't know why. The reading of enemy attacks sometimes is a bit weird as well. It sometimes doesn't feel like you've even hit something, even though there are hit markers, like they've tried in certain areas, but it just still doesn't feel like there's a complete, well-formed connection between my actions and the world around me, and vice versa, the world around me's actions and my response. It just felt a bit disconnected. And this wasn't helped by the fact that there are maybe 10 enemy types-ish that you will run into in the world around you, and some of them are just so freaking annoying. Like, you kind of get a feel for, okay, this one's the one that's ranged and it chucks its buzzsaw at me, and this one's the one that shoots artillery at me. But when you're running around the upstairs kind of area of the world, the open world part, you basically have these little robots that will hover around and repair any robots that you destroy. So let's say you enter an area and you take down 5 different enemies. Those are going to get repaired in 20 seconds or so. And so if you then move into a different group of enemies, you might still have those 5 chasing you. And then more are going to spawn in because there's also an alert level in the game, like a GTA style one. And if you get to that second level of alarm, even more enemies are going to be spawning in. And you have to prevent that happening by destroying little cameras that are everywhere, but those cameras also get repaired by the repair bots. So you could destroy a camera, 20 seconds later, you don't realize the camera's back on, it's behind you, and now you're at alert level 2, and there's even more stuff spawning in. And so you've got all these different enemy types, and they work in all these different ways, and some of them are shooting little projectiles at you, while others are literally ramming you and things like that, or they're firing lasers at you, or whatever it might be. But because of the disconnect between you, the player, and the world around you, you again don't really know where anything is. And because the FOV is really limited, I was playing on console, and because your sensitivity feels a little bit weird on the sticks, you end up sort of jankily swinging your aim around like, where the frick is the thing that's shooting me right now? Only to realize that it's halfway across the map and it's just firing missiles at you, and you've just got to go and chase it down while the whole world is chasing you down. The system doesn't work. It just isn't fun, to the point that I just stopped engaging with that open world upstairs because it was just annoying to me. It was a chore. And it's a real shame because there's a lot of game up there that they clearly put a lot of effort into, but you're really dissuaded from actually exploring it. And aside from the weapons, you do have your glove, and your glove does help a lot because you can get abilities on your glove. So for example, you can get Frostbite, which will freeze an enemy, and you can get upgrades which mean that that freeze lasts a lot longer. You can get other things that are good for crowd control, like lifting enemies into the air and then slamming them down. These are useful tools, but in practice, the way that they work in combination with the gunplay just feels a bit janky at almost all times. Like, you might want to fire out some frostbite, but then by the time you get through the animation, the thing that you want to shoot at isn't there anymore, and it's kind of delayed a little bit as well. Or maybe you want to fire out some polymer goo, which you can use to help you do elemental damage to enemies, but to actually hit them with the polymer, you kind of have to aim up, but then you can't fully see what's going on around you because your aim is tilted up to try and get the polymer to arc in the right direction. Like, it just didn't feel that good. And that's a real shame because it's really cool when it works, but it works significantly better in isolation downstairs. Now, the exception to that, when less is not more, is the boss fights. There's only one enemy in these fights, but it's no longer a case of, okay, I can focus on one enemy and therefore use my entire kit to its fullest, but rather you kind of feel shoehorned into approaching them a very specific way. And so they're a lot less fun than I think they could be if there was a lot more room for you to play them in different ways. I want to be clear. I love the boss fights in this game. I enjoyed them massively. I think each boss I either killed on my first attempt or my second attempt, with the exception of the final boss in the game, which I'll talk about later because it's in spoilery territory and I'll give you a warning first. But I really enjoyed the boss fights. I liked all the mechanics. I liked having to learn how the boss was acting. I thought that they actually implemented them extremely well. I just also feel like they were complete bullet sponges, and it got pretty tedious constantly just dodging the same old moves from the boss and then running up to it and hitting it with my axe a few times before running away. Maybe if I'd hit the boss and actually felt like it had changed the boss in some way, maybe the boss had spun away from me like, hey, don't do that, buddy. That could have felt good. But again, this sort of disconnect between you and the world, it never really feels like you're damaging the boss almost, with one or two very rare exceptions. The fights were awesome. I love the mechanics. I just, again, feel like it lacked a little bit of visceral feeling that would have massively improved the experience. So if it's not the gameplay that's pulling you through the world, what is it, Milo? Well, it's the story. The universe that they've created is unbelievably fleshed out, to the point that I actually almost wish it wasn't, because it very quickly feels like there's actually too much going on. Now, I know that might sound insane. Maybe you think, oh, video game reviewer, can't play video games, terrible. But you start moving through the story and you find these computer systems called pairs. And these essentially allow you to just read a bunch of emails. It feels very Black Ops 1 terminal, and some of it is really cool. You learn about certain characters, you start seeing names repeated in them, and you're like, okay, I'm getting a feel for who some of these background characters are in this world. But there's also a lot of junk in there, and it's an awful lot of reading. And so fairly quickly, most players are going to start tuning out of those pair systems. And the game realizes that it's given you way too much information. Like, it's fully aware of it, because after about an hour or two, the game just decides that it's going to start explaining the plot for you. It's going to completely exposition dump through the use of your glove, Charles. This sucks so much ass. And it's so unfortunate because it's such an intriguing world. It's so intricate and detailed, but they couldn't find enough ways to show you that intricacy, and as such, they just have to spoon feed it to you via masses and masses of voiceover from your glove, or from heaps of reading. And it's made worse by the fact that they're all Russian names, and this isn't me saying I've got anything against Russian people. This is me saying that if you've ever read any Russian literature, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the problem that everyone's name ending in Ovanov or whatever means that it's much less easy for you to figure out who is who. Like, the different names blend together a lot more because of that. Romanov, Sechenov, Ravanov, Reznov, Gorlov. It's so easy to start getting mixed up, and as soon as you do, you only confuse yourself more. So, on the one hand, the game giving you some handholding through that problem, probably a good thing, but at the same time, it feels really dreadful to feel like you have no choice but to receive the entire plot from your glove as opposed to from the world. And one of my biggest areas of annoyance with the game is actually this exact area, but it's not the exposition. It's the fact that while it's happening, if you move into certain areas or if you undertake certain actions, it cuts off the dialogue. Like, there is story dialogue that I was listening to. At certain points I was super engaged with, and I would step into a room, it would completely just go blank. It would stop talking to me. Instead, it might start a new conversation triggered by me entering that new space. Or it might interrupt it and just go away and be gone. And this happened so much throughout the game, to the point that when certain things were happening that I was listening to, that I wanted to get to the end of, I would just have to stand still and wait, because I didn't want to accidentally move into a new room and cut off the audio. And this feels so crappy. Like, you're like, wow, this environment is really cool. Oh my God, so many moments in the game felt like this. You want to explore, you're intrigued, you're fascinated, and you start taking a few steps and then you're like, wait, I must not move because I want this character to get to the end of their sentence. And then you're like, oh God, it's a paragraph. I'm screwed. And you end up standing there for 3 minutes just waiting, all because you wanted to listen to the character at that moment. Oh, I hate this system. Most of the time in a game, if they've got some kind of audio that's got to play, they figure it out so that the environment you're in takes the audio's length of time to progress through, so that if you go through it at max speed, you don't miss the essential audio. And if you go through slower, you just have a few seconds in the room, which isn't full of conversation, which is fine. This game doesn't do that at all, and it's annoying as hell. I now want to talk about the final act of the game. I'm not going to spoil specific events, but I'm going to talk in broad strokes about the themes, I guess, present, but this won't spoil the game for you. So you end up in the game having these quite surreal, almost flashbacky sequences where you're no longer even you, like you look different and you're kind of exploring Candyland almost. And it's just generally very surreal and trippy. And as soon as the first one of those happened, I was locked in. I was like, this game is trying to do some bold, stupid ass stuff, and I am here for it. And so things progress in the main arc of the game, the main story, and you don't know who to trust, and there's people backstabbing each other and all those sorts of classic things. But in the background, you're like, okay, that's all well and good, but why did I just turn into a cat? And then the game realizes that it hadn't exposition dumped enough up to this point for you to understand what's going on. So you get to this archive room and you learn about your past and you learn a little bit more about why you're so messed up, because obviously you do. And you can read maybe a dozen computer terminals. It genuinely takes like 20 minutes just to read through it all. And on the one hand, it's great and you learn a lot about the world from doing so. But on the other hand, it's freaking reading, man, in a video game. No one likes doing that. And then you get to the final boss, and I wanted to talk about the final boss. I'm not going to be specific here, but it's a really cool fight. It's the only main boss fight where there's more than one foe in the arena. And again, you run into the problems I described before of feeling like you're focusing on one thing, but something's happening off screen and you don't know why you're receiving damage, and it's just a bit annoying. But the fight itself is very cool, and this one did take me a couple more tries to learn how to get through, and I really liked that. But then you wrap up the boss fight, and the game ends in such a weird way, and I love that. It was so brave. I was so impressed by the fact that they made this bold a move. And so I now have heaps more questions about the game that I want answers to, and I'm sure some of that is in the computer terminals. If I went back and played through again, I could learn a lot about those things. But I think there's also a massive amount of room for Atomic Heart 2, and I am so not mad about that, and I actually really want it to happen. And I really do want Atomic Heart to do well, even though I think it's massively flawed. I think that there's a gem in here, it's just buried under layers and layers of rubble. And if you can push those out of the way, too much exposition, get it out of the way. Awkward gunplay, get it out of the way. Annoying movement system, get it out of the way. Infinite numbers of locked doors, get it out of the way. You get past all that, underneath, there is something really beautiful and special here. And if there was an Atomic Heart 2, and they did manage to avoid implementing some of those layers of rubble in the first place, it could be an incredible experience. Like, the idea, the drive behind a lot of this stuff, I thought was really fantastic. It just isn't the best in execution. But for a first game from a studio that started a couple years ago with 4 friends, I think, that just wanted to make a game together, this is a really, really damn good start. And while I don't think that Atomic Heart is a 10 out of 10 by any means, I think that it's quite poor in its execution in a lot of areas, I do think that it's something that you should consider playing. But there is the controversy surrounding it right now, which will impact your decision. And like I said, I've talked about that elsewhere. If you've enjoyed this review, please drop me a like. And if you want to watch my full playthrough, I've got it linked in the description down below and on screen now. Thanks, folks. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.